Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. We come now to another one of our Atin lay segments, that place where we take typically Latin, though I leave myself some wiggle room, and I've already done at least one Greek expression, but typically a Latin phrase that is common in theological discourse, and we spend a few minutes trying to unpack it so that we, if we are a lay person, are in a better place to understand that conversation, to join in that theological conversation. And of course, today we're going to look at the Latin expression de fide. That is D-E, new word, F-I-D-E, de fide. And being translated literally, it merely means of the faith. De fide means of the faith. And it's used as a word to describe that which is essential to the Christian faith, that which is of the essence of the Christian faith. To put it another way, that without which something cannot be the Christian faith. In a manner of speaking, these are doctrines or dogmas that are necessary for the faith or for one's faith to be Christian. You can't, for instance, be an atheistic Christian. You can call yourself an atheistic Christian. You can say, well, I'm an atheist and I adopt Jesus as my role model, and so I'm a Christian. But that's not what it means to be a Christian. That's not what Christianity is. It's not its essence. Are we called to follow after Christ? Of course we are. But it's not of the essence. In fact, it's wrong. What is of the essence is belief in God. Being atheist is de fide. But friends, there's so much more, as we talked about in another segment, remembering that James says, you believe there's a God? Terrific. So do the demons. They believe and shudder. So believing that God exists is not sufficient to make one a Christian. Denying that God exists is sufficient to make one not a Christian. Well, what else is de fide? Well, I would typically argue it this way. That which is de fide, that which is necessary, that which is of the essence. And let me just take a quick lap around it one more time so you understand what we mean. When we say that without which the thing would not be, when we say essence, think of it this way. You are you. But if you're like me, there was probably a time in your life when you had more hair on your head. Maybe not, but probably. There was probably a time in your life when you weighed less. My baldness doesn't make me not me, even though there was a time when I had a nice thick head of hair. My thickness in the middle doesn't make me not me, though there was a time when I was more lean. So those things are not the essence of me. In the same way, when we say de fide, these are the things that are of the essence of the faith, that without which the thing could not be. So what's on that list again? I would suggest we start with that which has been affirmed by the early ecumenical creeds. What do we mean by ecumenical? What we mean by ecumenical is these are meetings that were called to invite Christians from all across the world to come together and define and delineate particular doctrines, and to fence out of the church heretical doctrines. So that, for instance, when the Council of Nicaea met and hammered out what it meant for God the Son to take on flesh and dwell among us, as it came up with its understanding of the incarnation or its doctrine of the Trinity, it put fences around which we don't go. When we condemn modalism as non-Christian, then we're saying this is de fide. Believing in the Trinity is de fide. Believing in the incarnation is de fide. I would say the Apostles' Creed is a wonderful list of that which is de fide, that without which is not the Christian faith. You take out your belief that Jesus is coming again to judge the quick and the dead, and whatever else you may believe, you can still believe in the Trinity. You can still believe in the incarnation. But if you deny that Jesus is coming again, I believe you've denied the faith. It is essential. If you deny the resurrection, this is what Paul says. Paul says, some of you are saying there's no resurrection. You deny the resurrection, there's no salvation. You've blown the whole thing to smithereens. There's nothing left. Well, Paul is saying the resurrection is de fide. It is of the faith. Now, there may be disagreements about what's de fide and what's not de fide. I would argue that justification by faith alone is also de fide, that without that, you don't have a doctrine of salvation, which means, or a biblical doctrine of salvation, which means that you're not a believer, whatever else you might say. Now, there are all sorts of what we call secondary issues that have importance, though not primary importance. Whether or not you believe in predestination or not doesn't make a difference about whether or not you go to heaven. It also doesn't make a difference about whether you'll be in a better part of heaven or a worse part. That said, I think it's important to believe in. I think the Bible teaches it. But it's not de fide. So this concept is important. It teaches us to seek, at least, to try to understand what are the essentials and what are secondary or even lower down the tier in terms of importance, because that's going to make a profound impact on who we recognize as our brothers and sisters in Christ and who we look at as those we're going to proclaim the gospel to in the hopes that they will be brought in. If you've been paying attention at all, then you should have noticed the pattern that we find ourselves in. We are, as we've noted in the past, going through the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and we have come to the subsection of the Shorter Catechism that covers the Ten Commandments. And we have discovered this other pattern, that it's not at all unusual for our fathers who gave us the Shorter Catechism in breaking down these Ten Commandments to ask at least these three questions about each of the Ten Commandments. First, what is the first or the second or the 10th commandment? That's question number one. And then the answer is whatever that commandment is. Then the second question is, what does this commandment command? And then the next one is, what does this commandment forbid? Well, we just finished last time we were together on the Shorter Catechism a look at what the 7th commandment forbids, which means you should not be surprised that today, when we come to question 73, we find this question: which is the 8th commandment? The 8th commandment is, the answer goes, thou shalt not steal. Any questions? We could just end this segment right now. This is pretty straightforward. I don't think there's ever been a theologian that has wrestled with and struggled with what could this possibly mean. In fact, I may have reminded you that the Westminster Divines not only wrote out this Shorter Catechism, but it was their habit to include proof texts to go along with the things that they had to say. And there is one connected to this particular answer. One proof text is Exodus 20:15, where we read, "Thou shalt not steal." Okay. Again, pretty simple, pretty basic. But it is also, friends, pretty simple and pretty basic of us to have a propensity to reduce the Ten Commandments down to something manageable. You know, when I look back at my life and I think about how have I done with the Ten Commandments, there are certainly things that jump out at me that are obvious that I have failed to do. I have taken God's name in vain more times than I could probably count. I have coveted that which belonged to my neighbor. All of these things are pretty obvious to me. And I come to the 8th commandment, and I can, quite literally, reduce this down to one thing. I can look back at my life, and I can honestly say the only time that I recall ever stealing something from a business in the sense that this was, in the sense of taking that which belonged to the business and not paying for it. The only time I've ever done this was probably, I think I was in junior high, maybe in high school. I don't remember where I was, but I was somewhere out of town, and I wanted to buy a postcard. I think the postcard was 25 cents. And I was in this shop, and I was ready to pay for this postcard, and no one came, and no one came, and no one came to check me out. And I had no change. I only had $1. And rather than leave that $1 for that 25-cent postcard, I took that postcard. Now, understand that if that's the only sin I ever committed in the whole of my life, I would be due God's eternal judgment. But as easy as it is to narrow this definition of stealing down to that kind of a circumstance, I'm still guilty of that. But of course, the reality is there's a million ways in which I have broken this commandment, and I continue to break this commandment. In fact, I think it's profoundly interesting that it's with respect to this commandment that God, in His providence and in His mercy, actually gave us the hint of the way to understand all of the 10 commandments. That is, when we move from the raw, specific, particular physical manifestation of the breaking of a particular commandment to that which Jesus unpacked for us in the Sermon on the Mount, that lusting in our heart is a form of adultery, and hating our brother unjustly is a form of murder. That whole concept is already here in the connection between the 8th commandment and the 10th. That the 10th commandment is to the 8th commandment what lusting in your heart is to the 7th commandment, or what hating your brother unjustly is to the 6th commandment. It's already here. Well, when we come back next time, we're going to look at how the Westminster Divines began to unpack again a fuller sense of what it means to steal. And we're going to find out that I have more than one strike against me on this particular commandment. And, of course, so do you. So let's not steal too much from next week's catechism segment with this week's catechism segment, but let's plant our flag with the clarity of what we know, that we are called to not steal. If you are at all familiar with the town of Ligonier, Pennsylvania, then you are likely also familiar with this trio of landmarks known as Idlewild Park, Storybook Forest, and Timberlinks. out there on Route 30 between Ligonier and Latrobe was this amusement park, this child's fairy story forest, and this par 3 golf course all belonged to the MacDonald family. And the MacDonald family had a son named Charlie. And Charlie is one of those forever friends that I want to give thanks to God for. Now, Charlie and I probably never saw too terribly eye to eye. I don't think Charlie was a particularly devoted man spiritually. I don't think he was necessarily all too terribly well behaved. And he moved generally in a social circle that I was not a part of. You see, the MacDonald family was particularly close with the Mellon family. The Mellon family was the deepest of pockets in the whole of Ligonier, and in fact, one could argue the very reason for Ligonier's existence. And the MacDonald family, as I say, were very close friends with the Mellon family, going back at least 2 more generations before my friend Charlie. So we weren't in the same social circle, but we managed to become friends, and friends that stayed in touch. You know, Charlie was in my class from the 4th grade through the 8th grade when I was attending the Valley School of Ligonier. And for most of that time, we really weren't that close. I guess as we got a little bit older, we got a little bit closer. And we actually grew our friendship after we had finished at that school. Charlie went on to attend Avon Old Farms, a prep school in Connecticut, a feeder school for Ivy League. He served as a disc jockey there, and I remember from time to time just chatting on the phone with him while I was away at school in Wichita, Kansas, at a decidedly not New England prep school, though it was competitive academically. It was a very different cultural situation. But Charlie and I remained friends, and we talked with each other, and we were relatively, for 2 teenage guys, relatively open and honest with each other, dealing with some of the hardships. Now, I have one particular memory that especially stands out, actually 2 of them, about my friendship with Charlie. This amusement park, Idlewild Park, is a beautiful park, and it was the place where every year, at the end of the school year, our school would have its school picnic. And Charlie's dad, of course, was in charge of the whole place, and so getting chummy with Charlie could lead you to get some good tickets to ride the various rides there. Charlie was sort of by my side when I had my very first date there, by the way. You may remember me talking about a young friend whose name I didn't give, who was also a classmate at the Valley School, whose sister was a girlfriend, my very first girlfriend. We had our very first date right there at that park, and Charlie was very much in the conversation about whether or not he would ask out my girlfriend's best friend to be his date. It never came to pass, but I guess maybe that's what we had in common, an interest in girls. Charlie was also a decent athlete, not an amazing athlete, who really excelled in lacrosse, which was a new sport to us our last year at the Valley School. But he was also an outstanding goalie, kept me from playing goalie in soccer as much as I would have liked because he was so much better. But the other story is this golf course. If you've not been there, Route 30 or the Lincoln Highway is the oldest transcontinental highway in the United States, running from, I believe, Philadelphia all the way to San Francisco. Then happens to run right through Ligonier, Pennsylvania, and right between the amusement park and the golf course. On the other side of Route 30 is Timberlake's golf course, a par 3 course, and it wasn't at all unusual for me and often my friend Randy Gooder for us to go play a round of golf there. And I remember one day doing that and setting up to hit one of my shots from the fairway. And as I'm in the middle of my backswing, I hear this loud noise that distracts me. And thankfully, I was able to stop my downswing and not hit the ball, because zooming by comes Charlie on his mini bike. He had this, by virtue of being the son of the owner, he had access to all these places. He and I drove that mini bike around the park when it was closed. I got to see behind the curtain. So again, lots of shared experiences. Charlie was again genuinely kind. He could be rough, he could be tough, but he was genuinely kind in his spirit. And I just appreciate him. I appreciate him sticking with me, being a friend to me, first when I first got interested in girls, and then when we both went through the trauma of being sent away to school. So Charlie, I've already done a little bit of research, seeing if I could track you down to get this to you. If I succeed and you're listening, I just want you to know that I thank God for you and for your friendship. And for the rest of you, once again, don't forget, take up my counsel, please. Do this for one of your friends. Honor God and thank him for the friends that are in your past, whether they share the faith with you or not, and let them know that you're grateful for them. And if you would, let me know how it turns out. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.